The Crusades and the complex relationship between church and state. The Crusades stand as one of the most defining and dramatic episodes in medieval history. These military campaigns, initially launched to reclaim the Holy Land from Muslim control, had profound implications not only for the political and military spheres of medieval Europe but also for the intricate and often tense relationship between church and state. The Crusades were as much a struggle for spiritual salvation as they were a contest for political power, and they significantly influenced the evolving dynamic between these two powerful institutions. In this exploration of the relationship between church and state during the Crusades, we will examine how the Crusades themselves were shaped by political agendas, how the church wielded its authority over secular rulers, and how the growing power of kings and monarchs gradually altered the influence of the church in European affairs. 1. The church's authority and its role in the Crusades. At the time of the Crusades, the Roman Catholic Church held an immense amount of power over medieval Europe. It was not just a religious institution but also a central political force with the ability to shape kings' actions, influence law, and dictate morality. This made the Church a significant actor in the crusading movement. 1.1. Papal authority and the call for crusades. The driving force behind the Crusades was the Pope, whose religious and spiritual authority over Europe was unparalleled. The papal calls for crusades were not only a religious directive but a means to consolidate church power. When Pope Urban II called for the First Crusade in 1095, he framed it as a divine mission to reclaim the Holy Land from the Muslims and to protect Christian pilgrims who had been persecuted under Muslim rule. However, there were also significant political motivations at play. Papal leadership. The Pope's ability to marshal the Christian kingdoms of Europe to unite under a common cause demonstrated the extraordinary power the Church wielded. Urban II framed the crusade as a moral imperative, offering participants indulgences, forgiveness of sins, in exchange for their efforts in the campaign. This was both a spiritual incentive and a powerful tool for encouraging mass participation. Papal control over kings. The Pope's ability to mobilize armies and resources also showcased the Church's influence over secular rulers. Medieval kings and nobles were often more than willing to answer a call to war when the Pope sanctioned it, partly because of the Church's enormous influence over their legitimacy. The papal blessing was seen as divine approval, essential for a ruler's political stability. 1.2. The Crusade as a tool for church influence. The Crusades served as a potent instrument for the papacy to expand its influence. By rallying knights and common people to war, the Church consolidated its role as both a religious and political entity. Expansion of papal power. The success of the Crusades, particularly the initial conquest of Jerusalem, allowed the papacy to assert even more authority over both the spiritual and temporal realms. The Crusaders' success gave the Church greater credibility, which in turn strengthened the Pope's ability to control Christian monarchs and influence European politics. The papacy and local rulers. While the Pope wielded power through calls to arms and religious legitimacy, local rulers and monarchs also sought to leverage the Church's support for their own political agendas. The Crusades, in a sense, were a battleground not only for religious dominance but also for the control of territory and political power. 2. Secular rulers and their role in the Crusades. While the Church played a pivotal role in initiating and leading the Crusades, secular rulers, such as kings and emperors, were indispensable for their execution. The Crusades were not only religious wars, but also opportunities for kings to gain territory, wealth, and prestige. 2.1. Kings and monarchs, religious and political motivations. For many medieval kings, participating in the Crusades provided opportunities for both religious merit and political advantage. The quest for territory. Many of the Crusades were motivated by the desire to expand royal territories. Kings like Richard the Lionheart of England and Philip II of France sought not only to defend Christendom but also to extend their influence in the Holy Land and the surrounding regions. The Crusades allowed them to establish new Crusader states, such as the Kingdom of Jerusalem. The desire for prestige. For monarchs, taking part in the Crusades offered an opportunity to gain recognition and honor. The idea of fighting in the name of God, while also achieving military victories, served as a form of prestige that enhanced the king's reputation both at home and abroad. 2.2. The relationship between church and state during the Crusades. Despite the significant religious motivations of the Crusades, secular rulers were not mere subjects of the papacy. The growing political influence of monarchs, especially by the end of the 12th century, led to tensions with the church's authority. Power struggles between church and monarchy. As kings became more powerful, they began to challenge the papal supremacy that had defined the early stages of the crusading era. Conflicts like the investiture controversy, 1075 to 1122, and later struggles, such as Henry II's conflict with Thomas Becket, signified growing tensions between monarchs and the papacy. While kings still depended on papal support, they increasingly sought autonomy in their political and military endeavors. Monarchical influence on crusading decisions. Over time, secular rulers began to have more control over the Crusades. For instance, while Pope Innocent III played a major role in calling for the Fourth Crusade, 1202 to 1204, the leaders of the campaign, particularly Venetian officials, steered the Crusades' direction toward their own economic and political interests. The sack of Constantinople during the Fourth Crusade is a notorious example of the divergence between papal spiritual goals and secular political realities. 2.3. The rise of national monarchies. By the 13th century, a trend toward stronger national monarchies emerged in Europe, leading to an increased secularization of political authority. Kings like Philip IV of France increasingly sought to curb the power of the Church, asserting their sovereignty over religious matters within their territories. The expanding role of monarchs. By the time of the later Crusades, monarchs had more leverage in shaping the political landscape of Europe and the Holy Land. Monarchs like Louis IX of France were personally involved in crusading efforts, but also sought to assert their authority over crusading activities in a way that reflected the growing power of secular rulers. 3. The consequences of the Crusades on church-state relations. The Crusades brought long-term consequences for the relationship between church and state, which had lasting effects on the political and religious landscape of medieval Europe. 3.1. The shift toward national sovereignty. As the Crusades progressed, the authority of the papacy, although still potent, began to face challenges from rising secular monarchies. The Crusades, which had begun as a mechanism for church expansion, eventually served as a way for kings to assert their autonomy. Decline of papal power. The failure of later Crusades, combined with political struggles such as the Avignon Papacy, 1309 to 1377, weakened the moral and political authority of the Pope. The Church's ability to influence kings and dictate military campaigns diminished over time. Increased secularization. As monarchs increasingly pursued political goals independent of the papacy, the Church's direct influence over secular affairs waned. The Crusades, which initially seemed to unite the Church and secular rulers under a common cause, revealed deep political divides that set the stage for the secularization of European politics in the subsequent centuries. 3.2. The legacy of crusading and church-state conflict. The Crusades ultimately set the stage for a complex relationship between church and state in the centuries that followed. While the Church would continue to exert significant influence over spiritual matters, secular rulers would increasingly challenge the authority of the Pope in political matters. The growing power of monarchs, along with increasing economic and military autonomy, would lead to the rise of the modern nation-state and the gradual separation of religious and political authority. 4. Conclusion. The Crusades were a defining moment in the history of the relationship between church and state. While initially a tool for the papacy to assert its spiritual and temporal authority, the Crusades revealed the growing political ambitions of European monarchs and the limits of papal power. The outcome of the Crusades contributed to the decline of papal dominance over secular rulers and heralded the rise of national sovereignty and secular political authority. The legacy of the Crusades, therefore, is not only defined by its religious and military outcomes but also by its impact on the church-state dynamic. Over the course of several centuries, the relationship between the two institutions would evolve, eventually leading to the separation of church and state.